Here in Salt Lake City, so we're excited about potentially coming back. We're excited about the turnout, and we're really excited to work with the Art and Art History Department. This has been a great a kind of approach, trying to find an excellent artist that really does a lot with light art, and that's something that we're passionate about from a architectural standpoint, and we're hoping to be inspired by Rafael. I wanted to note some of the sponsors because we got quite a bit of support from people in our industry, and then several of them have actually come to tonight's event. So we've got Optic Arts, Lumen Pulse, we've got Holm, Tech Lighting, and Pinnacle Lighting. So if you guys could please just give them a round of applause, that was very, very much appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Craig. And now for the main event. There's a lot to say about Rafael Lozano Hemmer, who one Guardian critic called the world's most famous electronic artist. Born in Mexico City, he moved to Canada to pursue a degree in chemistry, but luckily for us, he ended up migrating to the visual arts, becoming one of its most renowned practitioners. He's best known for creating and presenting theatrical interactive installations with light and shadow in public spaces across Europe, Asia, the Americas. And having experienced these installations, I can say that they're unique in their capacity to integrate and activate the viewer by bringing forth what I can only call the magic and poetics of technology. Throughout his body of works, he explores ideas regarding perception, surveillance, and their infiltration in contemporary life. But it is a unique configuration of his scientific background and knowledge of computers, combined with an interest in music and performance, that give his work with technology a body and a pulse. In 1994, Lozano Hemmer coined the term relational architecture to describe the transformation of buildings and urban environments through the technological superimposition of audiovisual elements that recontextualize them. In this way, his work crosses disciplines, boundaries, and media through large-scale installations in public spaces that encourage, in fact, require the presence of a viewer who becomes a participant. He is the recipient of too many prestigious awards to list here. Among them are 2 BAFTAs from the British Academy, a Golden Nika at the Prix Arts Electronica in Austria, the Governor's General Award in Canada, the Trophée des Lumières in France, and the International Bauhaus Award in Germany, and that's just to give you the flavor of this kind of very global scale of his recognition. He boasts also a very impressive exhibition history, including solo shows at the MUAC, or the Museum of Contemporary Art in Mexico City, the San Francisco Museum of Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney. And we talked today about, I think, 5 different places where his work is currently being exhibited and exhibitions that he's planning for next year in Korea, Switzerland, and Brazil. He was the first artist to officially represent Mexico at the Venice Biennale with an exhibition at the Palazzo Van Axel in 2007. He was also shown at biennials in Havana, Istanbul, Kochi, Liverpool, Montreal, Moscow, New Orleans, Seoul, Seville, Shanghai, Singapore, and Sydney. You see what I mean, right? His work is in the collections of MoMA in New York, the Hirshhorn in Washington, D.C., MUAC in Mexico City, and the Tate in London. His large-scale public installations have been commissioned for events such as the Millennium Celebrations in Mexico City in 1999, the Cultural Capital of Europe in Rotterdam in 2001, the UN World Summit of Cities in Lyon, expansion of European Union in Dublin, and the Winter Olympics in Vancouver, and now the pre-opening exhibition for the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi in 2015. We're so lucky to have him here tonight, and I want to ask you to help me welcome Rafael to Salt Lake and to the UMFA.
Thank you so much, Elena. Okay, let me just arrange my shuffle with my controls here. One of these is for my notes. Okay, you saw that I have a jacket, right? I'm going to take it off. So I was respectful, but now I'll take it off. And there's some water somewhere here.
On the top.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be in Salt Lake City for the first time in Utah. I did do about 2 or 3 years ago a piece at the Sundance New Frontiers section. Sadly, at that time I couldn't come down, but I'll never make that mistake again. I want to thank very much Craig, Elena, and Whitney for organizing this talk here today. And I want to just sort of walk you through what we're going to do is instead of focusing on just 2 or 3 pieces, what we're going to do is a pretty panoramic view of production for 25 years. So lots of smaller video clips of pieces, but I am going to try and weave in some of the reasons why I do what I do, some of the themes that I'm interested in returning to often. And I'll pay particular attention to the works that are based on lighting, because in part I'm here thanks to the International Association of Lighting Designers. So just to mention a little bit about myself, apart from the whole list of things that Elena went over, after I studied chemistry in university, I learned to program there with very early VR systems for molecular recognition. But as soon as I was given my degree in chemistry, all of my friends were composers and dancers and writers and artists. And so because of the bad company, I started hanging out with them, and we started doing theater. And because I didn't have any of the talents they had, and the one thing I could do is program, what I would do is I would actually program stage design, so interactive lighting, interactive computer graphics, interactive sound, so that the dancers or the actors could actually control the staging. And that was kind of like my participation. I kind of became the director of these plays due to my absence of specific talent in a métier, in a field. And then what happened after is a lot of these performing art-based pieces became more pieces for outdoors, for public art, and for museums, where, as Elena said, the public themselves becomes the actor or the main sort of participant in the interactive art piece. I have 2 main lines of work. So half of my work is in public space, large scale, often temporary, son et lumière, like light and sound spectacles that transform temporarily a site during a festival or during the inauguration of a museum or something like this. And then the other half of my production is more for museums and collections. For the first about 10 years of my practice, I was very much against collections. I always talked about this vampiric and necrophiliac ostentation of the art market and the desire to possess and control as something that was really negative and stupid. And then now I have 7 galleries, so I sold out, and now museums collect my work. But I do still believe that the artwork is not an immutable object. It's something that is more of a process or a performance. And so I still think of a lot about my work as performing arts. It is not time-based, because time-based, as you know, is something that repeats and loops. It's more event-based. In other words, it takes place at the performance with the public participating. I see that there's people over there. There's tons of seating over here. Maybe, please come in, because otherwise we're going to be here for 3 or 4 hours, and I don't want you to get tired. All right. So as I was saying, there's these 2 lines of work. Again, about the kind of work that I do, I see myself more as a director, as somebody who is interstitial, somebody who connects different disciplines. My studio in Montreal, Canada, is a studio that has 12 different people. Half of them are engineers or programmers who want to be creative and often are. And then half of them are artists, but they're nerdy artists who are interested in programming and math. With this team, we develop pieces. And one of the nice things about the performing arts compared to the visual arts is, in the performing arts, no one is enamored with this 19th century idea, this romantic idea of the artist in front of his or her canvas looking for inspiration. But rather, collaboration is a very normal thing in performing arts. And so if you look at my website, you will see that for every single one of my pieces, I direct it and conceive it, but then there is a linguist or a programmer or a composer or a photographer. Everybody who works on the project gets credited. And I really believe in this kind of work because on the one hand, you need to have like a singular bias, an idiosyncrasy, right? A backbone for the artwork. So there's somebody who's calling the shots, but everybody else who participates in this project, has a collaborative role. Sometimes I'm not the director. For instance, I've done collaborations with architect Emilio Lopez Galeacho. He's the director, and then I'm only in charge of the visuals. And I really like that too, because what I don't like is the idea of negotiating what the piece should be. In my opinion, art should be experimental, and we shouldn't sit around and develop artworks out of consensus. I know that some people can. I certainly can't. Okay, so before we go into the individual examples, just something about light. If I ask some of the people who are interested in light art to name some of the important artists in light art, you might think of somebody like James Turrell or Dan Flavin or Irwin. The traditions of light art that we think about often have very formal, sometimes even spiritual lines, so Turrell's Quaker, and there's this idea of inner light and so on and so forth. I come from a very different tradition of light art. My parents were nightclub owners in Mexico City. For me, light is a place like the light of the club, is the light that confuses you, is the light that allows you to hide, is the light where once you're at the club, you can be somebody other than yourself. The strobes and the special effects and all of this artifice helps you enter a carnivalesque place where you can be someone other than yourself. So on the one hand, I have that sort of disco background. On the other hand, there is an interest that I have in the light of interrogation. The light of the police choppers looking for Mexicans at the border, for instance, or the light of the police interrogation that blinds you. Goethe once said that the brighter the light, the darker the shadows. I come from that team, from the team of understanding light as something that is violent. If we think about the sun, which is, our defining image of our time is the new solar observatories, we look at these explosions, which actually create the light that gives us life. And there's nothing smooth or soft about it. It's turbulent and very perverse, in my opinion. And then finally, about light, it's this idea that light itself is schizoid, right? It doesn't know if it's a particle or a wave. I love that. I love to work with a particular element, which it depends on how you look at it, it can actually be interpreted differently, experimentally even. All right, so I'll start the presentation talking about the enemies. So a lot of the work that I'm going to be showing is about public space. I am concerned about some things that are taking place in public space. As part of what I do, often I meet politicians, for example, who want to revitalize their city center. And sadly, what politicians mean by revitalizing is putting 19th century lampposts and Gap stores and cobblestones. And that's actually making your city the same as everywhere else. There's an enormous amount of homogeneity coming on in the globalized city. So Churchill once said, we make buildings and buildings make us, but the contemporary situation suggests that that's no longer the case. Buildings no longer represent inhabitants, buildings represent capital, because a new developer or an architect or an urban planner will actually optimize his or her investment into the building, and the solutions are the same whether you're in Salt Lake City, Singapore, or Mexico. And what that means is that there is this default buildings, this formulaic modular structures coming on everywhere, and this is sadly a revitalization that is actually making all cities look alike. Gentrification, of course, is just the simple idea that some of these developments price the housing out of the reach of the original inhabitants. Architainment, a word that I really dislike. is this idea, if you've ever been to Istanbul, Istanbul was always a city that was impeccably lit. It had an urban planning with like, it would tell you what temperature, your color temperature your buildings need to be lit at and so on. And now if you go, you will see the Bosphorus, one of the Bosphorus bridges has this awful color changing luminaires, and the thing looks like you're in Las Vegas. And I love Las Vegas in Las Vegas, but I do believe that so many designers are using color without actually studying Joseph Albers or actually understanding color theory. And I can literally look at a building that is color changing for no reason, and if you tell me, well, that's a Griffin city color or whatever, if you tell me the brand of the projector, I can tell you, okay, well, now that's emerald green, now it's going to go indigo, now it's going to go amber, and so on. There is absolutely no reason why we should be so disrespectful to color as to use it in a color-changing luminaire. I'm very much against that. I think that we need to exercise restraint. The disappearance of public spaces for resistance, protest, and assembly. So the simplest example of that is, of course, a shopping mall or a corporate space where there are actually rules of conduct that says what you can and cannot do. Corporate takeover and logo creep. So how many times have you seen, like a building that isn't, say it's like a media facade, it takes over by this, is taken over by the advertising. And aesthetics of consensus. All right, so that's the problem. Now let's see what kind of solutions can we offer. So first of all, I like the idea of thinking about a work that is distributed, that it uses networks, that somehow it's an artwork which is activating a site, but that people from not just locally but globally can access. So of course that's the internet. In 1999, I got the commission to transform the Zócalo Square in Mexico City. And at the time when I did this project, on the left you see Tenochtitlan, which is the Aztec city that's underneath the Zócalo Square. And on the right, the actual buildings as we see them today. To the right is the National Palace. So the National Palace was PRI, so Center Party. The bottom is the municipal government building, so that was the PRD, so the left wing. The top was the cathedral, so the right wing, conservatives. And then the fourth wall is jewelry shops, hotels, and so on, the money. So all of the spaces were spoken for. How do you transform this space when so many layers of cultural identification are in place? And in addition, it's the third largest plaza in the world. It's the statistics say that there's over 1,000 protests a year in the Zócalo Square. But the scale is so massive that one day you might walk and there's 5,000 pharmacists crossing and you can hardly see them. You see, I don't know, like 3,000 students, whatever it is, they just get submerged by the scale of the place. So the only place that we could think of to intervene is the sky. We looked at the development of searchlights, very powerful searchlights. At the end of the 19th century, the searchlights were used in the case of that Eiffel Tower shot as the beginning of modernity, right? Like this new energy, electricity that could actually light up buildings. And then, of course, those same searchlights were misused, let's say, by Albert Speer in the Nuremberg Nazi rally, which is on the top right, and whose message was always, we are big, you are small. So it's an architecture of intimidation. Those same anti-aircraft searchlights were then used for victory parades after the war was won. And today, like in the bottom left, we associate the movement of searchlights to the opening of a new shopping mall or club. So it's a celebration because of those victory parade associations. And then most problematic of them all is on the bottom right, Jean-Michel Jarre's $48 million extravaganza in the pyramids of Egypt to receive the millennium. And I say is problematic not just because I'm envious of his budget, but the whole idea of bringing in a French guy to show Egyptians the majesty of their culture through these technologies is identitarian, and it's very problematic for me. So if this is the background, what was my proposal? What we did is we built a website that anybody could access from Mexico or anywhere in the world. The URL was alzado.net. And in that website, this is 1999, you could actually design huge light sculptures with 18 searchlights that were placed around the buildings of the Zócalo Square. These searchlights, you could direct them individually, you could make pyramids, zigzags, shapes of all kinds. And then once you were happy with your design in this kind of virtual view, you could actually send it to Mexico City, adding your name and maybe a dedication. And then the designs would arrive in Mexico City and would be rendered in the night sky over a period of 2 weeks. 1 week before and 1 week after the 31st, the designs would arrive, and every 10 seconds we would render one of those in the night sky. Now, this is a scene, for instance, on a Tuesday at 3 in the morning. The searchlights do not create a proscenium. There's no VIP way to see this. It actually occupies all of your peripheral vision. So the lights are constantly changing all of the canopy overhead. And it's quite destabilizing. That was important. Also, the piece didn't have a beginning or an end. It wasn't a cathartic show like a fireworks display that you just consume passively. But it was more something that's similar to like a fountain. It doesn't have beginning and end. It's just a constant transformation. Now here you have in the scene, now this is on a Friday at like 7 p.m. and people are just hanging out looking at the sky. In Mexico we have wonderful pollution which works as a natural like smoke machine, so the lights look nice and bright. Now as the lights did this, it was from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. so all night long we would be receiving the participation. Every time a new design would appear, the lights would stop for a brief second. And at that moment, we would photograph them from 3 or 4 webcams around the site and build a web page for each and every participant. So the system would send you an email saying, okay, your design has actually been rendered in the Zócalo Square, and it would send you a URL to your own personalized web page. And so you see this shape, for instance. The computer would automatically document it and then create a web page. On the left, you see the virtual views of what you had done at work or at school or at home. And on the right, the actual photographs from the very same vantage point. And this was really important in Mexico because in 1999 we had been voting for 80 years against the PRI and nothing had happened. So the idea that participation is a vehicle for transformation, that you could actually get feedback that your participation took place, was important. On the top right you see the comments, and those were completely uncensored. Most of them were things like, I dedicated this design to Margarita, I hope you feel better. You're at the hospital somewhere, marriage proposals, also a lot of Zapatista slogans. So that was an exciting part of the project.
Bonito, ¿no? Padrísimas.
Son muy potentes.
Hermosas. Me dijo mi mamá que esas luces las puede manejar uno que tenga ¿qué? Internet. Ah, sí, vamos a verlas.
No, más que nada son sistemas computarizados manejados de luces, pero no interviene nada de internet.
Sí,
son sistemas.
Sí,
interviene
¿Esto sí es
porque
internet?
de cada parte de la República hicieron sus diseños para que aquí juntaran las luces y se vieran
Entrevista a él.
5 minutos los diseños y pasan el nombre y la dirección del chavo que los hizo.
Y ahora que venimos al Zócalo, vemos las luces y ahora decimos, ahora estamos en un Hollywood, pero mexicano.
Sí, muy bonito, que es una obra de arte.
Uno mismo manda su diseño.
El mejor es el que hace así el techo.
Le preguntaba que si tenían algún significado cruzados y todo eso, por la cuestión de las constelaciones.
Nosotros no, de hecho, nos parece.
So through word of mouth, but also through the media, people would find out that if those lights were moving, is because someone somewhere in the world was actually activating it. Depending on participation for an artwork is a humbling affair, because if no one participated, the lights would just turn themselves out. Fortunately, the way that the internet works, it was a snowball reaction. We got 800,000 participants, 70% of the traffic from all the regions of Mexico, and the rest from 89 different countries. This is the same project, except in France, at the Fête de Lumière in the Place Bellecour in Lyon. Same project, same everything, just a better camera, so you can see what the lights are doing. And the most important thing about my work is what you see at the very bottom. You have hundreds or maybe even thousands of people walking around, occupying space in an activity other than shopping. That is the thing that I think is the most transgressive thing, or the biggest contribution an artist can make, is to activate those city spaces without it being a utilitarian sort of use. The architectures are very slow, as you can see. There's no strobing or anything like that. In subsequent versions of this project, we now have like stations also locally, so that you could all design your own designs right there in the square. So let me just fast forward. So. In 2010, the most recent version, instead of it being Java 3D, we started using Google Earth. So this is Google Map and Google Earth to make the designs. So of course, you know, the technology is evolving, and now all of a sudden, instead of us having to render the whole city, somebody else had already modeled it. The lights were placed along English Bay. And one of the problems with this kind of work is that, you know, you are using the world's brightest searchlights, right? That can be seen from a 15-mile radius. They're 10,000 watts each. You know, in Canada, for example, Vancouver is like the birthplace of Greenpeace, for example. So I got into a lot of trouble. Somebody called this work Environmental September 11th because we're using whatever, 280,000 watts of power. And then, because I've lived in Canada long enough, I knew how to have a good comeback, which is I told them, yeah, it's a lot of power, you're right, but it's good to know that it's less than 10% what a typical hockey game uses. And all the Canadians were like, oh, okay, no, don't touch our hockey. They were fine. They were fine after that. And so anyway, to just sort of complete this idea of the distributed piece, when you're in the internet, you're leading a pretty solitary, you know, sort of lonely experience. You're clicking on things, maybe you're liking a post or whatever, and you think you're having an effect in the real world. But we all know that it's not true, that it's just a distraction in your own bubble. Anything that we can do to connect that activity that is so personal or private or in your studies or whatever, to actually transform the city is something that's beneficial. Out of control. Really, really important in my works is that nobody tells you what to do or not to do. The pieces have to be platforms for people to represent themselves without this kind of didactic, pedagogical, or hand-holding. So I'll show you how that works. This is the inspiration for a project called Body Movies. I found this beautiful engraving by Samuel van Hoogstraten, who was a disciple of Rembrandt, who, like Rembrandt, used shadow plays to understand perspective. But one thing that was interesting to me in this engraving is the larger shadows are demonic and the little ones are angelical and pure. So this kind of relationship of scale to the monstrous inspired a project called Body Movies, which transformed the Schouwburgplein in Rotterdam. It's a big plaza with basically a cinema building. The cinema building is 60 foot high, or a little bit more. I think it's like 70 foot high. And what we did is we put two very bright projectors on towers, and they would cast the portraits of people from the streets, from the city of Rotterdam. And then we had two very bright projectors on the ground, casting very bright light, which, if nobody was on the square, would wash away all of the portraiture. So the interaction was very simple. As soon as people crossed the path of the bottom projector, their shadow was cast on the facade. As you walk close to or far away, your shadow would grow from 6 foot all the way to 60 feet or more. And then a game of representation started taking place in this piece, because people would interact with each other, they would interact with the portraits. And oftentimes, they would match their shadows with the portraits and animate those, kind of like a reverse puppetry. And the project, using shadows is a really intuitive device for interaction. Contrary to Vectorial Elevation, the piece you just saw for the Millennium and for the Olympics, the shadows, pretty much all cultures have a tradition of shadow puppetry or shadow theater, or we all play at at home with our shadows. And so people don't need instructions. They would just immediately take over and start these ad hoc narratives. So this piece is completely out of control. The behaviors that you would see, we'd saw like a man on a wheelchair project himself 60 foot high, crush everybody under his wheels and derive a lot of pleasure from that. Or you'd get, break dancers, or in the weekends there was a lot of kids, so that was fun. Tuesdays was methadone night at the nearby church, so all the drug addicts would come and prance around. So every day, every night, the performances would just continue. Technologically, we had computer vision. This is the very early version of it. So basically the computer is observing where the shadows are and identifying if any of them was overlapping with one of the portraits. What we would do is automatically, when there was a match between a shadow and a portrait, we would trigger a little MIDI sound in public space, like a little tick, just like a little feedback sound, so that you knew that that portrait had been seen and activated. And more importantly, once all of the portraits of a given scene were revealed, automatically the system would black out the image, cue a new image, and invite people to reorganize in the public space. So you'll see it in this next scene. People collaborate, they see all the portraits that there are to see, the computer does a blackout, we cue a new image, and people in a way are invited to reorganize, because the piece is not really about the portraits, it's about becoming the portraits. And it was a quite successful project. We've toured it to, 12 or 15 countries. And while I'm only showing you like 5 minutes of footage, I have hours and hours. You would not believe what people come up with. And then also, over time, they learn and they bring props and they start doing, all sorts of choreographies and stuff like that. Now, with a piece with shadows, as with all of my works, I'm interested in this idea of surveillance and being able to be honest about how these methods are done. So we call it the Brechtian moment, this kind of projection to show what the cameras are actually doing with an explanation in Dutch and English. And so the nerds out there, like myself, could come in and see what the mechanism was for the interaction. So that's an important thing to show how it's done. But the truth is that 90% or more of the people don't really care about the nerdy part. They just want to establish these relationships and start playing with each other. So these are people who don't know each other. They don't really care about the portraits, that's fine. And then the whole piece becomes a theater. So for example, she abused her boyfriend for 3 hours. Let me just put some sound so you can hear her. So you get the idea. And one of the things that's interesting about these kinds of enormous shadow plays is I'm really interested, like in the previous project, to amplify the presence of the passerby to an urban scale. The problem with a lot of interactive art in public space is that, well, how do you get large groups to participate? And so in the case of Victorial Elevation, people take turns. Basically, you have a lineup, and every 10 seconds there's a new design. Or there's another way to do it, which is you take averages, kind of like voting, like democracy. It just doesn't work. This project, on the other hand, is interesting because on the one hand, you're forming these big tableaus, these big images that take over the whole square. But at the same time, you are your own little guy, and so there's a really weird hybrid that comes out of this project. Okay, so, and yeah, well, like I said, this is it's been shown in many places. This is, for example, in Linz in Austria at the Hauptplatz. So this is the actual city government. And I think it's really important to grow people to the side of city governments to, I don't know, at least metaphorically, to have this sense of being present. All right. Dissimulation. So contrary to the virtual, which tries to pretend that things are real, we do the opposite. We allow buildings which are over-codified to pretend to be something other than themselves, to interrupt the narratives of a particular location, so that a square where you've been walking, for the past 20 years from work to home, all of a sudden you're walking by and inside of your shadow, you get this kind of interactive portrait. This project is called Underscan, and it was last shown in Trafalgar Square. Here we're seeing the footage from Lincoln, and in it you see these portraits, but then they see you. So the moment that you're walking by, you see somebody who is basically at rest. If you put your shadow on top of him or her, he or she will wake up and establish eye contact. And this is a really, I wouldn't call it comfortable, it's quite annoying. And the portraits, for as long as you're on top of the portrait, he or she will be scrubbing the playhead. So it's not like a loop, but they could just kind of stay there. And then when you're no longer interested in the portrait, you just walk away. And when you walk away, the portrait knows it, it goes back to sleep, and then disappears. And then it never appears again in the square for a really long time. So we had thousands of volunteers do their videos, and then sometimes they would find themselves, which was straight out of David Lynch. But this idea of this relationship of one-to-one with your shadow was very intimate. Technically, this was in 2005. This beautiful projector is called the DL1s from then high-end. Came out, and so there were robotic projectors that allowed us to put the portraits anywhere in a really large area, like 20,000 square feet. And then we had a very bright 110,000 ANSI lumen light source which would cast the shadows. Crucially, there was a tracking system, a surveillance. Not only would it detect where you were, it would predict where you would be in the future, 3 seconds into the future. You see those little crosshairs? That's a computer trying to estimate where you might be. And the reason that's useful is because then the computer could actually find which DL1 robotic projector could actually cast a portrait in your path. Because we didn't want the portraits to come to you, we wanted you to walk into the portraits. Again, all of this didn't really matter to most people, the nerdy part, but the technology was quite intense for its time. The transformation, like the scaling, the rotation, the deformation that you needed to do is completely done automatically from all in the round. And so from your perspective, you're just walking and there's just somebody who happens to perfectly fit your shadow. So this project has like a, if you want, a social component. So we had, as I was saying, local filmmakers record over 1,000 people in places like museums, community centers, universities, and so on. And we asked people to do whatever they wanted to do. The only thing we asked them is, at one point, look straight at the camera. And that's the point that we trigger when you're uncovering them with your shadow. So these are some examples. Most of the people just said hi, or some did sign language. It was in England, and I don't know why, but in England they like to take their clothes off, so that happened. But the whole idea of this project is that I'm not setting the content. The content is the people taking over their city. If you give people the opportunity to self-represent, they end up doing something that's, funny or thoughtful or critical, This guy says, "You look because I'm not homeless," that kind of thing. And just one sec, let me fast forward. Yeah. So just one more word about this piece. I really recommend, if you guys haven't read a book called La Invención de Morel, Morel's Invention by Adolfo Bioy Casares. It's a 1941 novel written in Argentina. Borges called it the perfect novel. And it speaks about a new kind of post-photographic device that can capture presence in 3 dimensions. And the protagonist of this beautiful novel is this guy who falls in love with a woman who happens to be a recording. And I won't tell you more about it, but they just reissued it in English, and it's just the best thing that you could possibly read. And this piece is kind of working with that, the idea that a recording is somehow in the past, and then you're sort of part of its history. All right, so relationship specificity. So do you remember that whole thing of, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, there was artists that I admire like Johann Gertz or Hans Haakes or Krzysztof Wojcicki or Rachel Whiteread. They would make these works which were very much, looking at the power narratives of a building and then just deconstructing them or trying to reinterpret that site. I'm not so interested in that because I think it's been done beautifully and there's other practitioners into it. I'm also not interested in a situation where you're supposed to study the community and come up with an artwork that the community agrees with. I find that really condescending, paternalistic, and wrong. And it's a simplification. So instead of that, what I'm proposing is relationship specificity. In other words, these artworks have these minor histories, these ways to interact, which then can tour and present it in other places without necessarily losing that specificity. So this is an example of a project that does that. It's called Pulse Park. It was it comes from a larger series of works that I've made that are biometric. It just means this is like a sensor similar to what you might find at a gym. It measures your heartbeat. And then as you hold on to these sensors, gradually 200 spotlights, they're just theatrical spotlights, beat to your heartbeat. And then once the entire park is going to your heartbeat, you release the sensor, computer records it, loops it, puts it in the very first light bulb in the array, and everybody who was there before gets pushed down one position in such a way that as you're walking Madison Square Park in New York, you're surrounded by the 200 most recent biometric readings. And of course the idea is after 200 people participate, your own heartbeat disappears from the park like a memento mori, like a little reminder that we're here only for a little brief time. The romantic part of this project is my wife was pregnant with twins, and being a nerd, I learned that the ultrasound machine can help you hear the heart of the fetus. So I asked for 2 ultrasound machines, and we listened simultaneously to the heartbeat of the boy and the heartbeat of the girl, and they were very different, and they were creating this rhythmic syncopation that's very much like Glenn Branca or Philip Glass or like Colin Nancarrow, minimalist music, where these rhythms just kind of create something grander than the individual. And again, this is what I was saying, people just occupying space. That's what I think is a success. Nobody's selling you anything. We don't advertise in the projects. I'm very careful never to accept sponsorship from people who want to convert it into a Grand Prix, because if you do that, you betray the trust of people and it becomes an advertisement instead of a corporate gift. So I'm all for corporate and public funding. I have to be, of course, these are expensive projects, but done with elegance and with sense of restraint. So this is an example of a project which then has gone to Bochum, Germany, has gone to several places. And again, the specificity has to do with this idea of taking over the city with your heartbeat, and we'll see another example of that. So this project is just using like ETC source force, which are just normal theatrical lights. Critical. So I genuinely believe in what the Zapatistas, if you remember that whole thing of the Zapatistas when they were saying that they weren't asking people to dream, they were asking people to wake up. I like that. I think that art needs to have the capability to be critical, to not offer just some spectacle which is going to quiet you down, but it's going to ask you to support some questions, to try and answer them, to change your beliefs. And to know that you're in on the artificiality. So what I'm going to show you next is perhaps the project that I'm most proud of, not so much because of what I did, but because of how people took it over. So it's inspired by this poem. It's a poem from 1926 by Icaza, who was one of the estridentista poets. If you're not familiar with estridentista, they were the Mexican nerds, the futurists of the 1920s. The very first usage of broadcast radio in Mexico was there because of the poets. The poets brought radio transmission technology and started doing their manifestos over this new technology, the Manifesto for Antenna Man and so on. In this particular poem, Javier de Icaza talks about this new loudspeaker that would be placed on the top of Popocatépetl volcano, and that people could speak through it and everybody could hear them. So it's this kind of amplification device. And I use that for activating a site called the Tlatelolco Square. It was for the 40th anniversary of the massacre of about 300 students who were peacefully protesting 10 days before the Olympics in Mexico City. So if you're not familiar with this story, the Mexican government came in, murdered, depending who you ask, about 300 people, and then they cleaned the blood and nobody reported it, so the media was completely complicit with it. How do you represent this darkness, this terrible memory? And what I did not want to do is just have like a plaque with the names, right? I wanted to create an anti-monument, something that was alive, something that would activate the memory of those who were lost in 1968, but in the context of the atrocities that are taking place in Mexico right now to this date. So the proposal was this. We made a megaphone which you would speak to freely without censorship, and your voice would be converted to light.
De la represión que vivimos en este momento, los mártires, todas aquellas personas que lucharon, que vieron por el futuro, pues muchas veces los dejamos en el olvido o solo recordamos la típica frase el 2 de octubre.
And the lights would hit the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So from the site of the massacre, the light would then hit the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and then also go in 3 directions around the city. And from a 15-mile radius, you could see these flashing lights, which were the voices of the people. Throughout the 3 weeks that this project was live, we had incredible statements from survivors of the massacre. We had like a man who said, "My name's so-and-so, and I'm here. And I'm here because I want to denounce, as a fireman, I want to denounce that routinely the government asks us to put coloring in our water tanks, so when we spray protesters, they're easily identified. And I became a fireman to protect people, not to be part of the apparatus of oppression," things like that. Or some guy said, "I'm the son of one of the soldiers who committed the massacre. I've lived with this guilt all my life, and I'm here to say I'm a new generation." Just like grueling stuff, non-stop, really touching testimonies from survivors, but also from students and from activists, from intellectuals, neighbors of the site who would speak their minds. And the possibility for expression without censorship and moderation, sadly, to this date, is something that is extremely necessary in Mexico. Let me just fast forward to show you what else this project did. So this guy, for instance, he's one of the survivors.
La reunión que se iba a efectuar aquí el 2 de octubre, casualmente no me dieron permiso en mi casa de venir y no sé, a lo mejor por eso estoy ahorita participando de mi experiencia. Me emociona bastante esta situación y no sé, actualmente estamos viendo que es necesario.
So as people talked, they didn't just talk about what happened in '68, they're talking about other massacres, like the massacre of Acteal or Aguas Blancas, or so many that we can sadly mention. Now, very important part of this project is that as the lights were hitting the buildings and then were being sent around the city, the voice was also simultaneously being converted into FM radio. So if you were to tune into 96.1 FM, the university radio station, for 3 hours every night, you could listen live to what the lights were saying. And so if you're at home and you can see the lights out of the window, or if you're in your car and you're like, what are those flashing lights? You could tune into the radio station and listen to what people said. And so in that sense, we tried to get the whole sort of circle of communication so that people would be able to see those lights and have their voice amplified to that urban scale. But at the same time, it was a radio program. It was basically the content live. And whenever people were not participating live, because it was a radio program, we had a whole bunch of content which were intellectuals or survivors of the massacre who would speak about 68. So in that sense, we would mix the live participation with the memory of the tragic event. Of course, we also had all sorts of other stuff, right? Like we had rappers and poets and, again, marriage proposals. The whole idea that the project is out of my control is important. So, all right, something less lugubrious. So the idea of alien memory, the idea that something does not belong, you know, like a UFO that lands. This is the world's largest aerostat. It's a 14-meter diameter spherical aerostat built in France, and it's hanging with helium, it's floating over Federation Square in Melbourne. It's exactly 100 million times smaller than the sun. And so what we did is we animated this helium balloon with the turbulence that can be seen at the surface of the sun. We worked with NASA, not just to get imagery from SDO and SOHO, the solar observatories, but more importantly, to get the mathematics to simulate the behaviors at the surface. So things like Navier-Stokes, reaction diffusion, Perlin noise, fractal flames. These are mathematics that allow us to create this ebullience, this activity on the sun, without it being a video loop. So it wasn't just sort of playing back that memory, it was generating that textures live. And this mattered because the project, of course, was interactive, so it had an app that you can download, and you could, for example, change the seasons of the sun. So in the Earth, we have 4 seasons. The sun has 11 seasons, and so you could actually go through them. Or you could also seed the equations. So I'll show you what that looks like. One sec. So here I am with the app, and so as you're passing your fingers over the surface of the app, you see that little dot on the surface of the sun. That's you seeding the turbulence. I mean, it's not particularly important or meaningful. It was more of a scientific visualization, if you will, of how these phenomena can be captured mathematically. And in terms of the technology, I mean, everybody can say, oh yeah, well, they just put in a balloon and then they projected on it, but that's not as easy as it sounds. The reason why people don't project onto balloons is because balloons bob and sway. And so as the balloon is moving, we had to track it with a camera so that our computer graphics were moving with the balloon. So when you look at it in the middle of the night, you go, oh yeah, it works, but it's actually really difficult to do accurately. So this is the calibration pattern, for instance, so you can see how much the balloon actually moves. All right. Or we do, well, okay. Let's skip that. Incomplete, let's just see. So always in a state of becoming something else. So part of the problem that I have in my work is that oftentimes, say it costs $300,000 to do a project like this. Sometimes it's given to me, say, by a sponsor, or by collectors, or by a mixture of government, and so on and so forth. And they always come to the opening, and then there's no show. Because, like, imagine in the shadow piece, unless there's people casting a shadow, there's nothing to see. So that's an example that happened here in the States, in Santa Monica in LA, for a project called Sandbox. So what we did is we put 2 stations, you see them here with truss, which had sandboxes on the stations. So people would go up to the sandbox, and that night, of course, they would stick their hands and play with the sand in the sandbox, but then their hands would be projected onto the beach. So this is a very big image. It's like 40 by 30 meters. But then, as people in the beach were walking around, we were also recording them, or tracking them with infrared surveillance. And you see those dots in the sandbox? That's the people on the beach. So you could see them and they could see you, and you could share these 3 scales. So like, you know, as an example with this one, when it opened, nobody was at the sandbox, so there was nothing to see, and it's very uncomfortable 45 seconds until some kid goes in and starts playing, and then everybody goes in and starts playing. And yeah, and so this kind of project is really about the content being the, you know, crowdsourced, being generated by the public. And again, much like the shadows, these turn out to be like very intuitive, and people would sort of take turns to go up to the sandbox, it's almost like a DJ booth, and then play with others. And again, I'll show you only 2 minutes, but there is like, I don't know, like 10 hours of this stuff. And people are quite, they're funny. Let's just fast forward. So there's little doggies with boots, because it's LA. Break dancers. This guy likes to burn people. So he likes to burn, and this guy doesn't like to be burned. Coca-Cola guy. You get the idea. So how do we use these projectors? I mean, these are 30,000 lumen expensive projectors usually used for advertising something. Here, they're sort of turned into experiences that connect people. So I say a really pretentious thing. I say, you know, typically our governments think that the solution, for instance, to terrorism is more surveillance cameras, right? And everybody who has some common sense understands that that is not a solution. The solution to terrorism is a lot, you know, more complicated. It has to do with diplomacy and wealth redistribution and addressing a post-colonial situation and so on and so forth. Culture is the solution to terrorism. The more cameras is not going to stop any of this happening. It just sells things. So how do you misuse these cameras to track illegal migrants or potential you know, sort of suspicious people, and create opportunities for connection? So what would happen if we take all of the surveillance cameras in our streets and we make them projectors? What if instead of assuming suspicion and taking images away from us, they gave us images, opportunities to establish those links that genuinely do make us safer? I told you I was a utopian. All right. Non-linear, so the projects have no beginning or end, no score, no catharsis. We've kind of looked at that, but basically the idea that the projects have an emergent quality to them. In this project, we took over Park Avenue Tunnel in New York City, and we made, this is 7 city blocks that have been out of reach, like the pedestrians have not been able to walk there for 200 years. And what we did is we put an intercom in the center of the, I should have shown you. We put an intercom in the center of the tunnel, and you leave a message, your message becomes light, and every new message gets passed to an arch of light which kind of flickers to your voice. So as you're walking through this tunnel, you hear 300 voices of past New Yorkers who just participated. And then as more people participate, your own recording disappears from the tunnel. We got 10,000 people a day in this tunnel. I was super happy with that. And in a place like New York, because of the history of violence and terrorism, there is a real importance to taking over infrastructure, right? Like allowing people to go into this sort of hidden archaeology of New York is already kind of special. And personalizing it and allowing them to have that relationship was important. As a funny story, when we were preparing this project, NYPD had a meeting with me and they said, Rafael, you know, we're going to have to consider putting like a 6-second delay so that if someone says something that's problematic, we could just delete it. And then I did something that as a Mexican Canadian I've always wanted to do because I've seen it in the movies. I said to them, this is America and it is your job to protect freedom of speech. And then they're like, oh, okay, yeah, it's true. And then so there was no censorship. I was very happy with that. And this was just, you know, right after Snowden, so you can imagine how that was an issue. Although on their side. This is also after the Boston Marathon bombing. So what they were worried about is that somebody would shout, hey, there's a bomb, or there's like fire or whatever, and create a panic. So what we decided to do is we made them a button. Actually, we made a button which was controlled by a docent, and she was like a freedom of speech activist. If she ever heard anything like that, she would press the button and replace automatically that memory with Kathy Acker or Laurie Anderson or some content from New York, which had like a lofty kind of content. And I'm really happy to tell you that throughout the 1 month show, we never pressed the button, not once. And again, lots of marriage proposals and stuff like that. People singing and telling you their poetry and so on and so forth. All right, intimate. So if the big Albert Speer is about intimidation, we seek the intimate. We seek the relationship of the personal. In this next project, there's a problem with participation. So myself and my colleagues, we always speak about participation as if it's something really positive, right? As if people wanted to have the spotlight. That's not always the case. And certainly it's disingenuous to think that that actually makes a change. Participation can be problematic as well. This is an asphyxiation chamber called vicious circular breathing. It's a big machine that is designed to visualize the air that is breathed by the people. The way it works is you go into a glass chamber, press a button, it opens a decompression zone. All the clean air leaves that decompression area. And then it opens into a main cabin where you're invited to sit down and breathe the air that has already been breathed by everybody before you. So it's hermetically sealed. You're sharing viruses, bacteria, pheromones, all kinds of airborne pollutants are there. And I think it's disgusting. I would never go in there. I was the first one to go in there because it was clean, but this piece has been now in several cities, and after a couple of months, apparently it gets really stinky. Anyway, so the air leaves through this system of tubes into a set of bellows that are sort of similar to the 17th century organs, that then sends the air into these valve systems, which make inflate and deflate 51 brown paper bags, which inflate and deflate about 10,000 times a day, which is the normal respiratory frequency for a person at rest. So the idea is that this entire experience is a way to visualize the commons. I don't know if you heard, but like the CEO of Nestle said that water wasn't a human right. So those kinds of idiots, are not understanding that this is a shared commons, right? Like the air, the water, the land that we stand on. And so when you're in this piece, if you participate too much, you die. So that's a twist on participation, but also you're making the air more toxic for future participants. And what I'm seeking to do there is just to sort of highlight this idea that, the resources are limited. All right, we're almost done, you guys. So self-representation, so again, the piece should be a platform for people to personalize, take over. This one is another Pulse piece, but this time with searchlights. So for the Guggenheim pre-opening, we put these lights in the Pulse Corniche, in the Corniche Plaza. And here what's interesting is all of the searchlights are actually controlling, the brightness of course is just the heart rate, but all the shapes that you see are unique to each participant. So the sensor actually measures systolic and diastolic activity, and then the forms that it creates in the sky respond to all of those variables. And so each person has like a unique reading. Okay, so you get the idea. Experimental, the outcome is unknown. Why make a project if you know what the outcome is? I have no idea. I think that if your idea is so good and so solid that you can express it in I don't know, application for funding, then you should just not do it. I think you need to be passionate about how fragile your idea is, and you have to be passionate about it being useless, and that they need to give you just a break, that there's no reason why you need to verbalize this before you do it, or preconceive what the outcome will be. Maybe not the best example, but this is so this is a fountain that we just did in my studio. It's a fountain that writes poems with water. So let me just fast forward real quick. So we have these thousands of ultrasonic atomizers under the basin of the water, and we computer control it with an LED driver so that we can write poetry with the vapor. And the poetry that is writing in this particular fountain is the poems of Octavio Paz, who's a Mexican poet who spoke a lot about the moments where poetry becomes voice, and then that voice becomes the atmosphere that we breathe. So in a way, it's kind of like the poetry goes into our bodies. And the idea of this breathing space is something that's private, but then when you exhale, now it's public. It just confuses that kind of relationship of community. We're making a lot of fountains nowadays because water is the light of day. So a lot of the projects that you have seen only take place at night because we're using lights. And I have 3 kids, and so I want them to see the projects. The technologies to animate water are very, very advanced, and yet no one is really, in my opinion, using them effectively to create interactive experiences. So this is just one example of many different fountains that we've been making. And this could be outdoors, so it could be whatever. And just to show you how it's done. Oh, can't show you how it's done. All right. Well, anyway, there's ultrasonic atomizers. You know aromatherapy? So that little thing, but thousands of them. The last thing I have to say is just a call for the hard to sell, for the controversial, for the unreasonable. I think if you're going to make an intervention in a building, you need to make it memorable. You can't just do the same thing that everybody else is doing. Well, here's one proposal of how we can do that. So this is a building that is being built now in Ejército Nacional with Periférico, and they are giving it to me to do a media facade. So what can you do with this that is different than all the other stuff that exists? Well, I humbly propose this. So there'll be an iris scanner at the columns, and you leave your eyeball behind. And then the entire building becomes this. I promise you, this will become a landmark building. Perverse people such as myself will go there to see this thing because it's different than everything else. And it's also like a little Buñuel kind of homage. So, yeah, I think if it's easy to sell, then you're not doing your job properly, or you're just not an artist. I think it has to be hard to sell. This is a project which it took me a lot of discussion with the developer that he just spent $1 million doing this, and we are doing it. All right. So just a note about this thing. The very last item is a GitHub. At my studio, all of our code is open to other developers because we are not in the business of creating software. We're in the business of, we can bring the lights back on. We're in the business of creating experiences. So we believe very much in open source. So if you are a developer, if you program in open frameworks or processing or Delphi or C++, whatever, Java, you can go and visit our repository. I mean, right now it's just starting, but our goal is to have all of our code for all of the projects for anybody to modify the projects as they wish into the future. And there's many other projects in lozanohammer.com. And I think that we have some time for questions, which I would love to take now. Thank you. Thank you. I think there's a microphone, and we have to wait for you to get the microphone because it's being recorded.
Right. So we're in order to hear your question for the people that aren't here that are watching at a later date, speak into the microphone. Did you have a question? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you did your event in Mexico regarding the students and the massacre, how did you get away with allowing them to have that freedom of speech without the authorities coming in and trying to shut you down because of the problematic events that may occur after?
It's a great question. The site is now owned by UNAM University. And UNAM, Mexico is a really troubled country, but it's got one thing that still remains that is unbelievable, and that there's a constitutional independence and autonomy of an entire university body that cannot be controlled by the government at all. So the site of the massacre was taken over by UNAM, and after about 10 years ago, they actually made a memorial site museum for it. And that was commissioned by the university. So that's how we did it.
That's wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. In the back.
Oh, yes. Can you guys pass it?
First of all, thank you for being here. This is awesome. I'm from Guadalajara, so it's like really cool to see a paisano doing this kind of work. So a lot of your work is very political. You seem like a very political person, and you seem very focused on community creation and communal creation. So I'm kind of curious as to how that translates into the process of creating this art, and who you choose to work with. A lot of your work is also very like anti-corporate, so how do you choose, you know, who you're going to work for and who you're not going to work for, and how you integrate social justice into that process?
Okay, so let's start with the corporate part. So I've worked with terrible corporations. Like, for example, I worked with Telefónica, which, if you know, is like a Spanish multinational that went into Argentina and tripled the prices of telephones overnight. They're really evil. But they have a foundation which gives me carte blanche to do projects. And so I literally negotiate on a per case basis whether it's worth working with this company or not. And in that case, it was. But I do have a long list of companies that I've turned down. You know how when you go into like some designer's website, they tell you all the companies or all the brands that they've worked with? I want to have one of those, but of everybody I've rejected. So I'll give you an example. BMW, which actually has a really nice art program support, they wanted to do body movies, the big shadow play in the Frankfurt Hauptplatz, the main plaza, during the auto show. And I said, yeah, of course, let's do it. You know, I don't have a problem. I like your cars. But then just like weeks before this was going to take place, the marketing department came in and says, yes, but every 5 minutes there should be a Mini Cooper car driving by in the shadow. And I just said, I can't do that. And it was a really super difficult decision, because had I accepted that money, I could have supported the entire studio payroll for a year. But the way I see it is it backfires. It would backfire on me and on them. So on the one hand, I don't have like a moral purity fundamentalist thing. I really like to work with corporations because I think they have a duty, a civic duty, to participate in this kind of activations of the city that are not for profit. And that in a way they do have, you know, some benefits to that, because people understand the idea of supporting the arts. But on the other hand, I do have certain lines. So let's see, who have I turned down? Hirshhorn was wanting to do solar equation, and NASA they called me, Rafael, we found the money. And I'm like, okay, that's exciting. Who? They said, Lockheed Martin. And I'm like, what? What are you talking about? Like, Lockheed Martin? And they're like, no, they have a like a civilian program. It's like, I don't care what they do apart from murdering people. Sorry, no, thank you. So it's just a very personal decision, and it needs to be taken by the artist on a per case basis. And I don't think it's prudent to just be anti-corporate, because that would also be naive. I'm a part of the problem, and I acknowledge my complicity with a culture of privilege. I may be Mexican, and I am, but I'm also very aware of the fact that I don't represent, you know, the dire circumstances that most of our paisanos are under, right? So that's on the corporate side. And then on the personal side, our teams, so we have 12 people in total at the studio. We were 10 for a while, but I started, of course, with just me, and you know, sort of growing. I think it's about as much as I can handle. Like 12 is just too many. I think that there's a moment where your studio now becomes a corporation itself and you become a manager. I do believe in management. I'm really interested in management because nobody teaches you to be a manager when you're in the arts, and it's a really important thing. But too much more would just really suck all of my time. So 12 is about right. But depending on the project, we collaborate. So we do projects with linguists or with ornithologists or with 3D printing people and so on. And the exciting part of being on my studio is that we're all ADHD. So whenever we get really good at heartbeats, we go and we want to do shit with fire or whatever it is. So there is that sense of just constant challenge and megalomania. And it makes it for a very, social process. What I'm not into is, because I was part of a community, it was called Pomo Como, and we were 10 people, and the composer wanted to do this, and we'd all sit, oh yeah, that's cool, and somebody else would want to do something else, and we kind of had fun, but at the end, the product didn't have a directorial direction. And I believe in that. I think that it's really important that somebody takes control of the content.
Hi, I'm Mexican too. Congratulations here. The Mexicans are taking over Utah.
Bad hombres.
Are taking, remember,
I'm a
Utah
bad hombre.
used to be Mexico.
I'm in Canada, so it doesn't apply to me, but I'm a bad hombre that has created 12 jobs. 12 jobs. And I bring in routinely $2 to $3 million into Canada from other countries. And so, like me, there's a whole lot of us, you guys. If you're Trump supporters, I just need to tell you, you need to check your economy, because we're part of it. Sorry. I had to do that.
Well, you mentioned something that intrigued me, and you said culture is a solution for terrorism.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
But culture, it's like every organization. When you're in business, you're always building on a culture that is maybe is different, like the Google culture or the Microsoft culture, or but they're different, and by being different, it creates...
No, what I mean by culture is, I mean culture, not cultural industry. I'm talking about translation, right? So the most important moment of coexistence of religions, for instance, happened at the height of translation in Toledo. So what do you need to really achieve sustainable peace? You need to understand each other. So translation is important. We need to know, well, what are the Iranian poets writing right now? And how can we stage some Iranian theater here? And how can we likewise take some Salt Lake City, creativity into Palestine? And all of those things take time, right? They take generations of people trying to establish bonds that are cohesive. And the speed with which somebody like Trump polarizes and destroys that extremely difficult generational connection between cultures is very fast. And it's immediately advantageous for them economically. Whereas to translate things, to redistribute wealth, to understand where does all of this animosity come from? All of these really heavy discussions we're not going to have here. They're about culture. They're about understanding history. They're about understanding politics. I'm not saying that everything goes. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying the solution is not more cameras on us. It's just like the Snowden thing. I mean, if you guys are not worried about what's going on, because, when Obama was in power, we were like, yeah, look, we know privacy doesn't exist and whatever. But now you have literally people who, in my opinion, and I respect kind of what you might think about this, you have people who are genuinely evil. And okay, so let's not talk Trump, like Putin or my own president, Peña Nieto. They cannot guarantee the integrity of their country, right? Because they are blind to economic, environmental, political disaster. So you know, if we're not worried, you guys, there's something really wrong, right? And yeah, the solution is not more technology. That's ridiculous. And I think if any of you, does anybody here think that the solution is technology? Seriously, let's go. Nobody, right? Like more cameras on us, like we lost. You know, we lost. Snowden shows we lost. They're getting away with it. And the more that Trump bravado goes on and on about, you know, Korea and China and all of this warmongering, it's all about making money. And we are losing. We are losing those battles, in my opinion. And yeah, the solutions are very complicated, but they're also common sense. They're culture. We need more culture.
When you're in the public space and you're dealing with unpredictability, I imagine you have some people who want to break what you've built. Do people do that, and how have you reacted to those situations?
That's a great question. So in the shadow play, the question is, usually they're boys, and they're 16. And what they do, and I'm sorry if I'm offending somebody here, but what they do is they put their trousers down, their pants, and then they put out their penis and they show how big they are, right? What's really interesting about this phenomenon, which has happened not too many times, but a couple of times, is that they'll go, look how big I am, and then after 2 seconds, no kidding, they will just put it back away, because there is this kind of self-censorship that takes place in public space where it's not cool. You just don't do it. You just sort of put it away and they go, I'm so radical, and now what? You know, and so what we've seen is that people self-moderate. It's really interesting. Another thing that we do is we design with weakness as part of the project. So for example, I have one piece where you have these levers and you point them. And as you point these levers, these big searchlights go and cross the skies, and you can sort of connect with other people, whatever. What we did is we made the really expensive part the base. And the lever itself is just a tube of PVC, which it costs $1.50. And so when the boys, again, they're 16, you know, poor things, they grab this thing and they break it and they mount it and whatever, then they feel terrible and they walk away, but the replacement costs $1.50. And you've sort of integrated the weakness into the interface so that what breaks is something that's quite visible but really inexpensive to change. So little techniques like that. Other things that we do is, I mean, we have cameras on you, right? So, I mean, you can, like in the sandbox piece, you know, you're being tracked by like the world's most impressive, you know, sort of surveillance system. Like normally surveillance systems make us small. Here you're 40 meters wide on the beach. So all of those mechanisms just allow people to self-control. Not always, but it's interesting. And the same with, like, for instance, the voice projects, right? So if you're concerned about people saying something about Mexicans or something offensive in the intercom in New York, well, that's not unlike what might happen at a park. If you're at a park, you may hear some stuff you don't like or don't agree with or whatever, right? But you're right there. You know, the people are accountable for what they're saying. And I think that if you censor it, then what happens is that's the only message you're sending. Whereas if you don't censor it, will you have some moronic input? Yeah. But it'll be like 0.5%. And then everything else will make up for it because people have a genuine thirst to actually participate and make a difference. Believe it or not, I really believe that. Throughout the world, people have things to say. And they're not being listened to, as we know, from the political process. One,
maybe
we're just
two?
getting started.
Two?
But I'm wondering if you sent in a proposal for the wall between Mexico and the U.S. And as I was looking at your work, I really thought you would make something wonderful and great. And if you haven't sent in a proposal, you should.
Yeah, no, I didn't send a proposal, but the one I like the most is about the binational state. That's the one I like the most, where what we create is like a area where both countries are, have ownership. I think that's incredible. That's how countries should be. They should be binational. Because I think that, or the other one, the one which is a table, where people come for dinner. from both sides. I mean, there's so many good ones already. It's like, I don't know if I can contribute to it. Also, there's a really long tradition of that going on, border art workshop and so on. A lot of people doing great work in the border. So I look at that stuff and I really admire it. And so far I haven't had whoa, I really need to do that.
Let it be noted that here it was suggested.
Yeah.
Do you ever create small-scale installations that have the same kind of impact as these ones? Or?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I often joke that my work is as big as my insecurities. So I always have the biggest balloon and the biggest projector, biggest robot. But now I go to psychotherapy. And so I'm good with tiny little things as well. So yes, I'm making a lot of smaller projects. Often they have similar themes, presence and absence, violence, representation, self-representation. But they have, and those are the ones that end up being at museums or private collections. Yeah. That's for another talk. For next year, you bring me back and I talk about museum stuff. Yes? So it's Adolfo Bioy Casares. Bioy is B-I-O-Y. Casares is C-A-S-A-R-E-S. And it's Morel's invention. And it is my gift to you. I did nothing. I'll only just mention it to you because you can read it in a day. It's just so wonderful. It's like the the Argentinian Matrix. It's like, ooh, there's something else going on. It's really good. And it's 1941. He's talking about holographic projection. I'm just saying. One last one? No? That's it? One more.
Okay.
Yay.
Sorry, thanks.
So something that interested me was you say your work is not really about catharsis. And in my own definition, I find that catharsis is sort of this healing process of releasing these repressed emotions. And in my own opinion, I find that some of your pieces actually are cathartic. And so I was just wondering if you could kind of explain or clarify that.
You're right. And what I meant more by catharsis is this kind of formulaic build-up that leads up to this moment of, of this thing because I find that cathartic spectacle is really manipulative, right? So I come from the tradition of muralism, right? Like muralism is the most manipulating, horrible thing you could ever imagine because it's trying to romanticize indigenous cultures while at the same time you have absolute disregard for them and you're complicit with the system that is oppressing them. So if you look at Son et Lumière, it's always this cathartic spectacle, right? So the Jean-Michel Jarre and the pyramids, right? Like they show you all of the great things and then it goes to one big moment where there's all this fireworks. And I find that really facile and infantile and problematic. But you're right that, at a club, that moment where you lose your identity, that's the catharsis. It's the carnivalesque, is this moment of interruption of your normal thing. So, or the piece with the voice for the memorial, that was cathartic for many people. But I meant more in terms of a script or a narrative that is predetermined. Well, thank you very much, Thank you.